The village of Ashwick Hollow was, by all appearances, exactly the kind of place where nothing ever happened. The lanes were quiet in the mornings, the hedges were trimmed on Saturdays, and the church bell struck the hour without anyone needing to check a clock. But on the morning that misses, Edna Fallow was found sitting upright in her parlour chair with a cold cup of tea in her hand and no breath in her body. Every person in the village would later say, very carefully, that they had heard something in the night. And not one of them would say what. Welcome back to Candlelight Mystery, where the evenings are slow and the stories go a little deeper than the surface. If you are settling in for the first time, we are very glad you found your way here. Pull something warm around you, let the outside world do what it will, and spend this hour with us. We hope, when this is over, that you will come back. There is always another story waiting, and the candle is always lit. Chapter 1, The Village That Holds Its Breath, The Morning Mist, had not yet lifted when Constable Reeves arrived at number 4 Larkspur Lane, and already there were 3 neighbours standing at the garden gate who had not been invited. That was one of the first things Miss Jane Marple noticed when she arrived, not the constable, not the ambulance idling at the curb, but the neighbours. They were standing very close together, and none of them were speaking, and that silence, in a village like Ashwick Hollow, was louder than any noise. Miss Marple had come to Ashwick Hollow 3 days earlier to visit her old friend Dorothy Stanhope, who ran the post office on the High Street, and had been sending her letters all autumn about a hip that was not quite right, and a village that was not quite right either, though Dorothy had not been able to say exactly how. Miss Marple had not thought it strange at the time. Dorothy had always been the sort of woman who felt things before she could name them. Now, standing on the pavement outside Edna Fallow's cottage, Miss Marple thought that perhaps Dorothy had been trying to say something quite specific after all. Edna Fallow was 63 years old. She had lived alone since her husband Gerald passed 4 years ago. She kept a tidy garden, attended St. Cuthbert's faithfully, and was known for her lemon drizzle at the autumn detail Miss Marple had learned from Dorothy over breakfast, along with the information that Edna had recently changed her will, that she had not been speaking to her sister for 6 weeks, and that she had seemed, in Dorothy's words, not quite like herself for the better part of a month. Miss Marple had filed all of that away without appearing to, which was something she was rather good at. The body had been discovered by the milkman at 7:30 that morning. The front door had been unlocked, not forced, not broken, simply unlocked, and the milk had been sitting on the step from the previous morning, uncollected, the milkman. A sensible young man named Tom Briggs, who had done the route for 11 years, had knocked, found the door open to his touch, and gone inside far enough to see Mrs. Fallow in her chair by the front window. He had not gone further. He had come back out, stood on the lane for a moment collecting himself, and then walked not run, he later said. He hadn't wanted to alarm anyone to the telephone box on the corner. That detail interested Miss Marple very much. The constable was a decent man, conscientious and not unkind, but he was also the sort of man who managed a scene by keeping it contained, and he had already politely asked the 3 neighbours at the gates to move along and not managed it. They had shuffled a few steps, but had not gone home. Miss Marple noted that the eldest of the 3, a lean woman in a grey cardigan whose name she did not yet know, had not looked at the cottage door once since Miss Marple had arrived. She was looking at the other 2, watching them very carefully, the way you watch people when you are deciding whether they are going to say something you do not want said. Miss Marple did not approach the gate. She walked instead to the low stone wall that separated Edna's garden from the lane, and she studied the front window. The curtains in the parlour were open. They had been open all night. Apparently Tom Briggs had said he could see the shape of Mrs. Fallow in the chair from the path, which meant the curtains had not been drawn at dusk as they usually were. That was a small thing. But Edna Fallow, by all accounts, was a woman of firm routine. Dorothy came up beside her, slightly breathless, her walking stick clicking on the pavement. Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it terrible? She was perfectly well last week. I saw her at the chemist on Thursday, and she looked well. She looked a bit strained, I thought. But I didn't say anything because you never know with Edna, she didn't like people asking after her. She always said, "I'll tell you if there's something to tell." Miss Marple said, Did she tell anyone, do you think? Dorothy paused. What do you mean? Only that if she had something to tell, she would have told it. Miss Marple looked at the window again. Who are the women at the gate? Dorothy lowered her voice in the way people do when they are about to say something they have been wanting to say. The one in the grey cardigan is Vera Peel. She lives 2 doors along. The younger one next to her is Carol Bright. She does the flowers at St. Cuthbert's. And the one at the end, the one with the red hair, that's Judith Crane. She and Edna were close. Once, not so close lately. How lately? Since the summer, I suppose. Something happened between them. Nobody knows what exactly. Or if they know, they're not saying. Miss Marple thought that this was probably the most informative sentence Dorothy had produced since she had arrived. She did not say so. She said, "Shall we see if there's somewhere to have a cup of tea? I suspect we'll be standing here for quite some time, and my feet are not what they were." They found a bench on the other side of the lane, near the old horse chestnut that marked the corner of the churchyard. From there, Miss Marple could see the gate, the 3 women, and the door of the cottage, and she could do so without appearing to watch any of them. She had found over the years that people were remarkably forthcoming when they believed no one was paying attention. Dr. Neville arrived at 20 minutes past 9. He was the village GP, a man in his mid-50s with the particular air of someone who had learned to deliver difficult news without inflection. He went inside. He was in there for 15 minutes. When he came out, he spoke to Constable Reeves for a moment, and Reeves wrote something in his notebook, and then Neville walked to his car without looking at the gate. That was the second thing Miss Marple noted. The first had been the milk. The second was that the doctor had not paused, not even for a second. At the sight of the 3 women, he had known they were there. He must have. They were impossible to miss, but he had looked straight ahead and walked straight to his car as if they were part of the hedge. There are moments, Miss Marple had always thought, where the thing that a person doesn't do is worth 10 times what they do. A man who walks past a crowd without looking at it has already decided he doesn't want to know what the crowd is looking at. And that, in her experience, was never entirely innocent. The sun had come through by 10 o'clock, and the mist had lifted from the lane, and Ashwick Hollow had the look of a village getting on with its day. Shops opened. A bicycle came and went. 2 children in school uniforms passed at a trot, not looking at the cottage at all, which meant their mothers had told them not to. Life, as it has a habit of doing, arranged itself around the difficulty and continued. But the 3 women at the gate had not moved, and none of them had spoken a word in the time Miss Marple had been watching. She found this the most interesting thing of all. Miss Marple did not speak to the 3 women that morning. This was deliberate. In her experience, the first approach was the one that set the tone for everything that followed, and she did not yet know enough to set it correctly. She watched, instead, and she listened, and she let Dorothy talk, which Dorothy did naturally and at length, in the way of someone who had been holding observations back for a while and was glad to have a reason to let them out. What Dorothy told her, over the course of that morning and a sandwich lunch at the post office back room, was this. Edna Fallow had been a private woman, but not an unfriendly one. She had her routines, her small circle, her habits. She had been on the flower committee at St. Cuthbert's with Judith Crane and Carol Bright for 7 years. She had been neighbourly with Vera Peel for longer than that. She had a daughter in Bristol named Patricia, who visited at Christmas and rang on Sundays, and she had a sister named Ruth, who lived in the next village, and who had, until recently, been her closest confidante. The falling out with Ruth was recent and apparently complete. Dorothy did not know the cause. She had asked once very gently, and Edna had said that it was a private matter and she would prefer not to discuss it, and the way she had said it had suggested very clearly that there was no point in asking again. Dorothy, who had known Edna for 30 years, had not asked again. The change in Edna's manner had come at around the same time as the falling out with Ruth. She had become quieter, not cold, not rude, but somehow reduced, as if she were taking up less space on purpose. She had missed the harvest supper for the first time in memory. She had cancelled her standing Tuesday lunch with Judith Crane twice running, and Judith had mentioned this to Dorothy in passing, with a look that Dorothy described as more relieved than concerned, which I thought was odd. Miss Marple thought it was odd too. She spent the afternoon walking. This was not unusual for her. She had always found that her thoughts arranged themselves better when her feet were moving, but it was also useful in a practical sense, because a woman walking through a village is almost invisible, particularly an older woman, and the things people say in front of almost invisible women are often the things they have been careful not to say in other company. She walked the length of Larkspur Lane twice. On the second pass she noticed that the curtains at number 6, which was Vera Peel's house, had been drawn since mid-morning, which was unusual for a house with a south-facing front room on a bright autumn afternoon. She noticed that the small blue gate at number 8, which was, according to Dorothy, where a Mrs. Hartwell lived alone and was considered a bit of a watcher, had been left slightly open, and that there were fresh footprints in the soft earth beside the path that suggested someone had been standing there recently without entering the garden properly. She noticed that the window box outside number 2, the house directly opposite Edna's cottage, had been recently watered. The soil was dark and damp despite the fact that the petunias in it were well past saving for the season. Somebody had been watching Edna's house from the opposite side of the lane, recently, and from more than one vantage point. Miss Marple did not find this sinister on its own. Village curiosity was a powerful thing, and not always malicious, but combined with the silence of the 3 women at the gate, it suggested to her that the watching had been going on before Edna died, not just after, and that the people who had been watching had been waiting for something. She was not yet sure what. She stopped at the village shop on the high street late in the afternoon, ostensibly to buy biscuits, and she found herself standing at the counter next to a woman she recognised as Carol Bright, the one Dorothy had said did the flowers at St. Cuthbert's. Carol was a tidy woman in her 40s, with the sort of face that suggested she had learned to keep her expressions arranged. She was buying a small bunch of chrysanthemums, not the kind for a church arrangement. The size was wrong. These were the simple kind you put in a vase at home. Miss Marple said pleasantly that it had been a dreadful morning for the village, and Carol said yes it had, in the tone of someone agreeing to close the subject rather than open it. Miss Marple said just as pleasantly that she hadn't known Mrs. Fallow well, having only arrived on Tuesday, but that she seemed to have been a well-liked person. Carol said yes, very well-liked, and looked at the chrysanthemums. Miss Marple said, mildly, I wonder if she'd been feeling unwell. It always seems so surprising when it's sudden. Carol was quiet for just a beat too long. I suppose it was sudden, she said at last, though she hadn't been herself. Oh, Miss Marple turned toward the biscuit shelf as if looking for something, which meant Carol did not have to meet her eyes. In what way? Another pause. Tired, I think. Worried about something. I didn't ask. She picked up her chrysanthemums. It wasn't my place to ask. She paid quickly and left, and Miss Marple bought her biscuits and thought about what it meant to say it wasn't my place to ask about a friend of 7 years who was worried about something. It could mean many things. It could mean polite restraint, the kind that good-mannered people practiced automatically. But it could also mean something else. It could mean that Carol already knew what Edna had been worried about, and that asking would have brought them both to a conversation neither of them wanted to have. People, in Miss Marple's experience, only said it was not their place to ask when they had already considered asking and decided against it for a very specific reason. Simpling curiosity didn't produce that particular phrase. It required prior thought. She walked back to Dorothy's house as the light was going from orange to grey, and the village was settling into evening, and the church bell struck 5 with its usual certainty. She thought about the 3 women who had stood at the gate in silence. She thought about the doctor who had not looked at them. She thought about a woman who had not drawn her curtains at dusk, which she had presumably done every evening of her adult life. She thought about a cup of tea, found cold in a dead woman's hand in the morning. A cold cup of tea meant the tea had been made, and then something had interrupted the drinking of it, something that had happened in the evening, when the curtains should have been drawn and were not. Something that at least 3 people in this village, possibly more, had either seen or heard or known about, and had collectively decided not to say. She let herself into Dorothy's house and found Dorothy in the kitchen making soup, and the smell of it was warm and good, and Miss Marple sat down at the kitchen table and thought that if evenings like this bring you comfort, you are always welcome here at Candlelight Mystery. There was something about a warm kitchen and a difficult question that made the world feel manageable, even when the question had not yet been answered. She said to Dorothy, "Tell me about Ruth." The sister. Dorothy set down her spoon. Chapter 2, the sister who stopped coming Ruth Fallow. She had never taken her husband's name. A detail Dorothy mentioned almost as an afterthought lived in the village of Crane's Bottom, which was 2.5 miles west of Ashwick Hollow by the back lane and 4 miles by the road. She was 2 years younger than Edna, which made her 61, and she had worked for 20 years as a bookkeeper for a small builder's merchant in the nearest town before retiring 3 years ago with, according to Dorothy, a modest pension and no particular plans. She and Edna had been close in the way of sisters who are genuinely fond of each other and have chosen to remain so, which is to say, it had required some effort on both sides, and they had both been willing to make it. Sunday lunches had alternated between the 2 houses. Birthdays were observed with real presents, not token ones. When Gerald Fallow had been ill, Ruth had driven over twice a week without being asked. Dorothy said all of this with the quiet authority of someone who had observed it at close quarters over a long time. The break had come in the last week of August. Dorothy did not know the cause directly. What she knew was that Ruth had been due for Sunday lunch on the 4th of September and had not come and had not telephoned. Edna had mentioned it in the shop, once, briefly, with a particular compressed expression that meant she did not want to be asked about it. Dorothy had not asked. No one, apparently, had asked. And Ruth had not been seen in Ashwick Hollow since. "Did anyone speak to Ruth?" Miss Marple asked. "Judith Crane did, I think. She rang her at some point in September. She mentioned it to me at the 50 committee meeting. She said Ruth had told her it was a private matter, and she hoped people would respect that." Dorothy paused. Judith seemed satisfied by that. I remember thinking it was an odd thing to be satisfied by. Miss Marple thought so too. When a friendship of many years ends, and neither party will explain why, and the people around them accept that silence without question, it usually means one of 2 things. Either the reason is so painful that everyone has silently agreed not to press it, or the reason is known to more people than are admitting it, and the agreement to be silent is a collective one. She slept well, which she usually did when she had the beginning of a thread, and the following morning she walked to St. Cuthbert's. The morning service was over, the pews empty, and the flowers on the altar were fresh white chrysanthemums, very simply arranged, which she understood were Carol Bright's work. There was a quality to the arrangement that was technically accomplished, but somehow careful. The way things are when they have been done by someone who is making sure they don't get it wrong. Not joyful. Correct. The vicar was a young man named Harper, which surprised her slightly. She had expected someone older for a village of this kind. He was earnest and warm, and he told her that Edna had been a faithful member of the congregation for as long as he'd been at St. Cuthbert's, which was 6 years, and that she had sat in the 3rd pew on the left and had never missed a Christmas service, and had always brought lemon drizzle to the harvest supper, which was not quite the same as saying she had been a particular friend of his. Miss Marple asked him whether Edna had seemed distressed lately, and he said, with some care, that she had asked to speak with him about a week ago. Not about anything specific, he said. She had simply come to his study after Thursday's morning service, and sat for a while, and they had talked about he paused and chose his words faith, and forgiveness, and whether it was possible to do the right thing when the right thing was not pleasant for anyone. Miss Marple said, gently, did she seem to be asking about a general principle or a particular situation? Vicar Harper was quiet. I assumed general, he said at last. But I have been wondering since this morning whether I assumed correctly. That was honest, and Miss Marple gave him credit for it. She thanked him and left, and she stood in the churchyard for a few minutes among the old stones, thinking, a woman who was not a talker by nature, who did not confide easily, who had been keeping a secret visible enough to strain 3 friendships simultaneously, who had gone to her vicar to ask about the right thing to do when the right thing was unpleasant but was not a woman at peace. That was a woman on the edge of a decision. She had not drawn her curtains, she had not drunk her tea, and something, in the evening, had prevented both. Miss Marple walked from the churchyard to the lane behind the church, which curved around to Larkspur Lane from the north. It was the kind of lane that existed in every village she had ever known, not a road, too narrow for 2 cars, used mainly by people who wanted to get somewhere without being seen on the high street. There was a back gate into Edna's garden from this lane. She had noticed it the day before, but had not examined it closely. She examined it now. The gate was wooden, painted blue once and now flaking, and it was latched but not locked. The latch was old iron, simple, and it moved without sound. She tried it carefully. The path beyond the gate was flagstone, slightly overgrown at the edges, leading to the back door of the cottage. The flagstones were damp from the previous night's frost, and on the 3rd stone from the gate, where the frost had melted into a thin film of damp, there was a mark. 2 marks, in fact, side by side, the kind left by someone standing still for a moment before moving forward or back. Someone had come through the back gate at some point recently enough that the marks had not dried. She did not touch anything. She took note of the marks carefully, and she looked at the back door of the cottage. There was a constable inside. She could see a figure moving behind the kitchen window, and she did not intend to go in without invitation. She did not need to. She had what she had come for, which was confirmation that there was a way into Edna Fallow's cottage that did not require using the front door on Larkspur Lane, and that someone had used it. She walked back to the high street through the front of the churchyard and stopped at the bench where she had sat with Dorothy the morning before, and she watched the lane for a while. The village was going about its Tuesday. Vera Peel came out of number 6 and put something in her dustbin and went back inside without looking left or right. Carol Bright's car was not in its usual spot on the lane. Dorothy had told her Carol drove a small red hatchback. Dr. Neville's surgery was on the far end of the high street, and if she stood at the corner of the lane, she could see whether his car was there. It was not. She had no particular reason to be interested in Dr. Neville's whereabouts. He was the village GP, and he had been to the scene of a death, and he had left quickly. These were all perfectly ordinary things for a GP in a village to do, and yet she kept returning, in her mind, to the fact that he had not looked at those 3 women. That was the kind of careful nothing that took effort. You had to decide not to look. You had to walk past 3 people standing at a garden gate and make a deliberate choice to treat them as furniture. That was not indifference. That was management. She wondered what he was managing and why. Dr. Neville's surgery was a converted Victorian terrace house, painted cream, with a small car park at the side and a waiting room that smelled of old magazines and distant antiseptic. Miss Marple arrived just after 11 without an appointment, which she knew was not strictly proper, but she had found over the years that being elderly and slightly vague in doorways produced remarkable results. The receptionist was a woman in her 30s named Mrs. Good, who had the particular efficiency of someone who runs a small operation by sheer force of organisation and does not enjoy surprises. She told Miss Marple that Dr. Neville was with a patient and asked whether this was urgent. Miss Marple said no, not at all. She simply had a few questions about her blood pressure medication that she wondered if she might clear up, and she sat down in the waiting room and picked up a magazine from 2019 and waited. She did not wait long. A woman came out of the consulting room, 40s, stout, moving with the relieved efficiency of someone whose appointment has confirmed nothing alarming, and Mrs. Good told Miss Marple she could go in now. Dr. Neville was a man who wore his composure like a suit. He was polite, precise, and the kind of good-looking that was more about bearing than feature someone who had learned to occupy space in a way that suggested authority without claiming it. He looked at her with the measured attention of a doctor meeting a patient he did not know, and said he was pleased to help. Miss Marple told him she was visiting Dorothy Stanhope and was here for a brief holiday, and that her blood pressure medication was perfectly fine. She simply wanted to introduce herself as she might need his services during her stay. This was completely untrue, but delivered with such domestic simplicity that it gave him no particular foothold. He noted her details and said they would of course be happy to see her if needed. She said, as she was rising from the chair, what a dreadful thing. Yesterday, poor Mrs. Fallow. Did she come to you much? He looked at her. It was a very brief look, professionally controlled, but it was the look of a man deciding something. She was a patient, he said. I'm afraid I can't discuss her case. Of course not, Miss Marple said. I only meant was it expected. At her age, 63, one always assumes there must have been a warning of some kind. I'll be issuing a death certificate in due course, he said. These things follow their proper channels. She thanked him and left. She did not know much more than before, except for one thing. He had not said no. When she had asked whether it was expected, he had not said no. He had redirected to process, which was the answer of a man who knew the honest answer was complicated. The phrase due course had also stayed with her. A man who expects to issue a death certificate says I'll be in touch about the paperwork. A man who is uncertain of the cause of death says things follow their proper channels, which is a way of saying there are more steps to come, and he would rather not specify what they are. She stopped on the high street and bought a small loaf of bread from the bakery, and while the girl was wrapping it, she asked idly whether she'd heard the news about poor Mrs. Fallow. The girl said, oh yes, wasn't it awful? She'd been in only last week for a seeded loaf. She'd seemed tired, but she'd seemed fine. Miss Marple asked if she'd been alone, and the girl said yes. Well, no, she'd been with Mrs. Crane, Judith. They'd come in together. But Mrs. Crane had waited outside. She remembered because Edna had asked for an extra bag for the rolls, and she'd looked out the window and she'd seen Mrs. Crane standing on the pavement looking, and here the girl paused, searching for the word concentrated, she said at last. Like she was thinking about something hard. Miss Marple thanked her, and left with her bread and the image of Judith Crane standing on a pavement, thinking hard about something she was not going to say. She walked back to Dorothy's and sat in the front room with a cup of tea and her thoughts and the bread, which was excellent, and she arranged what she knew into a shape that was still incomplete, but was beginning to have an outline. There was a woman, Edna Fallow, who had known something that had troubled her deeply enough to strain her closest relationships and send her to her vicar to ask about the nature of doing the right thing. There was a group of people, Judith Crane, Carol Bright, Vera Peel, possibly Dr. Neville, possibly others, who had some relationship to whatever that something was, and who had collectively agreed, before and after Edna's death, to say nothing. There was a sister, Ruth, who had stopped coming, and there was a back gate, unlatched, with footmarks in the frost. The question was not yet who had killed Edna Fallow, because she did not yet know that Edna Fallow had been killed. The death certificate had not been issued. The police were present, but not, so far as she could tell, treating it as anything other than a natural death a woman alone, in her 60s, found in her chair in the morning. It happened. It happened regularly, and in most cases it was exactly what it appeared to be. But a woman who had been on the edge of a decision did not usually die before she made it, and a village that went silent in a particular way collectively, carefully, as if each person had checked with the others before deciding, was a village that knew something it had decided to keep. Miss Marple poured herself more tea, and thought that there are two kinds of silence. There is the silence of people who have nothing to say, and the silence of people who have too much to say, and have agreed, between themselves, that none of it will be said. The first kind is peaceful. The second kind has a sound to it, if you know how to listen. It sounds, she had always thought, exactly like a village going about its business on a bright Tuesday morning as if nothing had happened, which was precisely what Ashwick Hollow was doing. She decided she would walk to Crane's Bottom in the morning and speak to Ruth. Chapter 3, What Ruth Knew the Walk to Crane's Bottom, took just over an hour by the back lane, and Miss Marple was grateful for the dry morning and the fact that her boots were sensible. The lane was beautiful in the way that English lanes in October often are, the hedgerows still holding a last defiant colour. The light low and clean, the air carrying something that was not quite cold and not quite warm. She had brought a small bag with Dorothy's ginger biscuits, and she walked at the pace she liked best, which was unhurried but purposeful, and she thought about Ruth Fallow. She had learnt more about Ruth from Dorothy the previous evening. Ruth was, by all accounts, a practical woman, not cold, but not given to sentiment. She had kept Edna's company through Gerald's illness with a quiet reliability that Dorothy found admirable, and others had found perhaps slightly impersonal, though Dorothy said she thought that was unfair, that some people showed their love through doing rather than saying, and Ruth was one of them. She had been a bookkeeper for 20 years. She balanced things. She liked things to add up. Miss Marple had found over the years that people who like things to add up are often the most troubled when they encounter something that doesn't. Because unlike the rest of us, who can sometimes accept a gap between what should be and what is, a person who lives by accounts cannot tolerate an unclosed column. They will keep trying to balance it, one way or another, until they either find the answer or make a decision about it. Ruth's house was the third on the left in Crane's Bottom, a sensible semi-detached with a well-managed garden and a car in the drive. Miss Marple rang the bell and waited and rang again, and on the second ring the door opened and Ruth Fallow stood there, a smaller woman than she had expected, slightly bird-like, with Edna's colouring, but without Edna's apparent warmth. She looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a person who has been expecting something difficult and is not sure whether this is it. Miss Marple introduced herself, simply a friend of Dorothy Stanhope's, visiting the village, terribly sorry about Edna. She said it in a way that invited no particular response, just acknowledgement, and Ruth gave it, briefly, and then appeared to wait. Miss Marple said, "I wonder if I might come in for a few minutes. Not to ask questions, I know this must be a very difficult time. I just thought you might want someone to talk to who isn't from the village." It was a careful thing to say. The last part of it was doing the real work, and Ruth caught it. She opened the door wider. The kitchen was immaculate, which Miss Marple had expected. There was a spreadsheet of some kind open on a laptop on the kitchen table, which she had not expected Ruth was working, or trying to, which was either her way of managing grief or her way of managing something else. She closed the laptop and offered tea with the efficiency of someone who has been taught that offering tea is the correct response to a visitor regardless of internal weather. They sat, and Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, which was also deliberate. People in the aftermath of a shock very often want to talk, and are only waiting for permission, and the best way to give permission is to say nothing and make it clear you have time. Ruth said, "I suppose you want to know about the falling out." Miss Marple said, "Only if you want to tell me. Dorothy will have told you there was one." She mentioned it, yes. She said she didn't know the reason. Ruth looked at her tea. She wouldn't. Nobody in that village knows, except the ones who ought to know more than they're admitting. She set the mug down on the table with a slight precision that suggested she had been rehearsing what to say and had now decided. Edna found something out, something about someone in the village, something important, and she told me about it because she didn't know what to do, and I told her what she ought to do, and she wasn't ready to do it, and we disagreed. She paused. We disagreed very strongly. Miss Marple said, "What did you tell her she ought to do?" I told her she ought to go to the police. Ruth said it flatly, like a number in a column. She wanted to handle it herself first. She thought she could talk to the person, give them a chance. I told her that was the wrong approach. I told her that people who do the sort of thing she had found out about do not respond to being given a chance. She stopped. She stopped talking to me because I wouldn't support her in doing it her way, and I stopped coming because I couldn't sit there and watch her make a mistake that she stopped again. That could go wrong. The pause before could go wrong had a weight in it that was not accident. Miss Marple noted it carefully. What had she found out? She asked, still gently. Ruth looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Miss Marple understood this was not a decision made lightly. I'll tell you, Ruth said at last, because she's dead now and I don't know what else to do. I've been sitting here since yesterday morning thinking about it, and I can't decide if I'm being brave or being too late. She picked up her tea and put it down again without drinking. Edna found out that someone in the village had been taking money, not from a business or a stranger, from a person who trusted them entirely, an older person who didn't understand what was being done. Miss Marple was quiet. Edna used to help with the accounts for the St. Cuthbert's Flower Fund, just a small fund, donations for the church flowers and decorations. She'd helped with it for years. This past spring she was going through the ledger, and she found that money had been moved, not a large amount, nothing that would show obviously, but it didn't add up, and Edna was good with numbers when she chose to be. She traced it. She traced it back to someone who had access to the fund. Ruth's voice was entirely steady now, the way numbers are steady, and then she started looking at other things. Because once you find one gap in an account, you have to check all the accounts. What else did she find? She found that the same person had been managing the finances of an elderly woman in the village, Mrs. Hartwell, who lives on her own on Larkspur Lane, who is 82 and has no close family, and who trusts the people she knows. She'd been asked to help with some paperwork a few years back, just to simplify things, and she'd been given a level of access to Mrs. Hartwell's accounts that had, over time, been used to take money. Slowly, carefully, in amounts that wouldn't alarm. Miss Marple thought of the small blue gate with the slightly open latch, and the footprints she had seen from Mrs. Hartwell's path. Who was it? She asked. Ruth told her. Miss Marple walked back to Ashwick Hollow in a different state of mind than she had left it. The lane was still beautiful, the light still clean, but she was thinking now with the particular focus that comes when a shape that has been approximate resolves into something specific, and the specificity is worse than you had prepared for. The person Ruth had named was Judith Crane. Judith Crane, who had been Edna's friend for 7 years, who had sat with her on the flower committee and known her finances and known her habits and known her schedule, and had, somewhere in the comfortable business of being a trusted friend, made use of that trust in a way that was systematic and quiet and had been going on for at least 3 years. Ruth had told her more. Edna had gone to Judith first. She had gone to Judith herself, not to the police, because she had believed, in the way of people who are loyal to their friends almost past the point of sense, that there must be an explanation. A mistake, maybe, some accounting error that would turn out to be nothing. She had given Judith the opportunity to explain. And this was the part that Miss Marple turned over in her mind. As she walked, Judith had been very calm about it. She had not denied it outright. She had explained it. She had said that Mrs. Hartwell had been confused and forgetful, and that what looked like taking money was actually a form of reimbursement for time spent helping, which Mrs. Hartwell had agreed to verbally. She had said the flower fund discrepancy was an accounting error she intended to correct. She had been very reasonable about it, very composed, and she had told Edna that going to the police was unnecessary and would cause pain to people who didn't deserve it, and that if Edna truly valued their friendship and truly cared about the well-being of the village, she would let this go. Edna had not let it go. But she had not acted, either. She had been held in the particular paralysis of a woman who knows what is right and is afraid of what the right thing will cost. Miss Marple thought about this as she walked. She thought about what Judith had said, "If you truly value our friendship." That phrase had a shape to it she recognised. It was the shape of kindness used as pressure, the shape of someone who understood that Edna's loyalty was her most exploitable quality and had placed both hands on it and pressed. The second layer of this story was becoming clear to her now, and it was not about money. Not really. It was about what happens when a community is built on warmth and trust, and one person learns to live inside that warmth as if it is their own possession, quietly taking what they need because they understand that people who are kind do not want to believe that kindness can be weaponized. Judith had not only stolen from Mrs. Hartwell, she had stolen from the idea that Edna had of their friendship, and having done so, she had worked very hard to make sure Edna paid the price of that theft by being the one who had to decide whether to dismantle it. She reached Larkspur Lane in the early afternoon and went directly to Dorothy's house. Dorothy was in the front garden deadheading roses with the focused inefficiency of someone who is really thinking about something else. "Dorothy," Miss Marple said, "I need to know something, and I need you to tell me honestly. On the night Edna died, were there people on this lane late in the evening?" Dorothy put her secateurs down. "What kind of question is that?" "An important one." Dorothy looked at her for a moment, and then she said, quietly, "I don't sleep well. I sometimes sit in my front room in the evening, lights off, watching the lane. Old habit. I'm not the only one. Vera Peel does the same." She stopped. Miss Marple waited. "I saw Judith Crane," Dorothy said at last. "On the lane. About 10 o'clock. She was coming from the direction of the back lane, the one that runs behind the church. She was walking fast, but she wasn't running. She was carrying something, a bag, I think. Small bag." She looked at the roses. "I told myself it was nothing. People walk on lanes at night. There's nothing wrong with it." "Did you see her go into Edna's house?" "No, she was already past the house when I saw her, coming from that direction, not going toward it." A pause. "But she could have come from that direction having been there, couldn't she?" It was not quite a question. Miss Marple said, "Yes, she could." Dorothy looked at her roses. "I should have said something," she said. "Yesterday morning, when we were all standing there, I knew, when I saw everyone at the gate and no one was talking, I knew we were all waiting to see who would speak first. And no one did. And I thought, perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps she had just been walking." She stopped. That was a cowardly thought. It was a human thought, Miss Marple said, without judgment. The trouble with human thoughts is that collectively they can produce the same result as cowardice, without any single person having been particularly cowardly. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. "That's the most frightening thing I've heard in a long time," she said. Miss Marple thought so too. Chapter 4, What Vera Heard Vera Peel, opened her door on Wednesday morning without warmth and without hostility, which was itself a form of information. She was a woman who had learned to manage her responses very carefully, and the careful management of a response to a stranger at the door, before she knew what the stranger wanted, suggested that she had been expecting someone to come and had prepared. Miss Marple introduced herself as Dorothy Stanhope's friend, and asked if she might come in for a few minutes. She said she had been thinking about Mrs. Fallow, and wondered if Vera might like someone to talk to. She used the same gentle offer she had used with Ruth. Because it had worked with Ruth, and because it was true, she did genuinely believe that people who were holding difficult things would rather not hold them alone. Vera stepped back from the door and let her in. The front room of number 6 was tidy in the way of a house that is cleaned from anxiety rather than habit surfaces that had been wiped too recently, cushions that had been straightened past comfort. A cup of cold tea sat on the coffee table, which Vera had clearly forgotten to drink in the course of whatever morning she was having. She saw Miss Marple notice it, and picked it up and took it to the kitchen, and came back with fresh tea for both of them. They sat. Miss Marple said, "I understand you and Edna were neighbours for a long time." Vera said yes, 22 years. Miss Marple said it must have been a terrible shock. Vera said yes, and looked at her tea. Miss Marple said, "I spoke to Dorothy about the night before they found her. Dorothy mentioned she'd been awake late. I wonder sometimes whether there's comfort in knowing whether it helps at all, to know that someone was nearby." It was not quite a question. It was an opening, placed with care. Vera looked up. "Dorothy told you she was awake." She mentioned it, yes. Vera was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to have a decision in it. "I was awake too," she said. "I do hear things on this lane. I've lived here long enough that I know the sounds of it which cars, which footsteps, which doors. She paused. I heard something the night before Edna was found. Miss Marple said nothing. I heard the back gate, Vera said, the one into Edna's garden from the lane behind. It makes a particular sound, not a squeak, more of a tap when the latch falls back. I've heard it before. Not often, but occasionally. Edna sometimes used it when she was coming back from the church that way. She stopped. I heard it twice. Once at around 9:30, and once at it must have been close to 11, maybe a bit after. Miss Marple thought about this. You heard it opened, and then opened again? Opened and closed, both times. The second time the sound was different, faster, like someone who was in a hurry to close it behind them. She stopped again, not in a hurry to open it, in a hurry to close it. Miss Marple thought about the difference. Someone who enters carefully and leaves quickly is someone who has done what they came to do and wants to be gone. Did you hear anything else? From the house or the lane? Vera looked at her tea for a long moment. I heard voices, she said, and her voice was very flat. Through my front window, which was cracked open, not words, just voices. 2 voices. One of them was Edna's. She paused. The other I recognised. Miss Marple waited. It was Judith, Vera said. Judith Crane. The room was very quiet. Outside, the lane was going about its morning. A bicycle, someone's dog, the distant sound of the butcher's van. Miss Marple said carefully, What did you do? Nothing, Vera said. And then I told myself it was nothing. 2 women talking. People visit at odd hours when they are friends of many years. I told myself that. She looked at Miss Marple. I knew, even as I was telling myself, that it wasn't nothing. Edna and Judith had not been speaking normally for months. They were not the kind of friends who visit at 9:30. And I heard she stopped. There was a quality to the voices. I couldn't hear the words, but there was a quality. The kind that happens when one person is asking something of another person and the other person is refusing. And you said nothing, Miss Marple said. Not an accusation. A completion. I said nothing. Vera looked at her hands, and the next morning Tom Briggs found her in her chair. She looked up. I don't know what to do with that. Miss Marple thought that this was an honest statement, and a difficult one, and that it deserved a real answer. You can't undo not speaking, she said. But you can speak now. There's still time for that to matter. Vera looked at her. To Constable Reeves, Miss Marple said. Today, I think. Vera said, You think she killed her? Miss Marple said, I think what you heard matters, and I think it should be said to someone who can act on it. I'm not Constable Reeves. I'm an old woman visiting the village for a few days. She paused. But I do think that a village that heard something and said nothing is a village that has taken on a weight it was never meant to carry. Vera was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Carol Bright heard her too. On the lane, late, Carol lives at the end, she might have seen more. Miss Marple said, Then Carol should speak as well. We thought, Vera said, and then stopped and then continued more quietly. We thought that if it came from one of us, it would look as if we were accusing, as if we had a reason to accuse, and then it would become about us, about whether we were reliable, whether we had some history with Judith. She's very good at that, at making things about the person who challenges her rather than about herself. She paused. She's been doing it for years. There it was. Miss Marple heard it clearly, not just the event of one night, but the long history of a community that had learned to manage itself around one person's talent for redirection. This was the kind of thing that happened slowly and without announcement. A village learned that speaking up about Judith Crane was costly, not because of any dramatic consequence, but because of the subtle social rearrangement that followed the way the story would shift, the way the speaker would suddenly find themselves the subject rather than the witness. It happened once or twice, and people learned, and then the silence became automatic, and nobody had exactly chosen it. That was the second layer. That was what had been building under the visible surface of this story since before Edna Fallow had ever opened a church flower fund ledger. Miss Marple set down her cup and thanked Vera, and she left the house and stood on Larkspur Lane in the mild October sunshine, and she thought about Judith Crane, who was still in this village, who had not been spoken to by the police, and who had, so far as Miss Marple could tell, gone about the 2 days since Edna Fallow's death in exactly the way she went about every other day, which was its own kind of information. Miss Marple found Judith Crane at the church. She had expected this might be the case. Carol Bright had mentioned that Judith went in on Wednesday afternoons to check the flower arrangements and set the schedule for Sunday, and it was Wednesday, and Judith was the kind of person who continued to attend to their usual tasks in a crisis, partly because it was useful, and partly because it looked composed. She was standing at the altar table making a note on a clipboard when Miss Marple came in. She turned at the sound of the door and she looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was perfectly open and perfectly prepared, and Miss Marple thought that this was a woman who had spent a long time learning how to be looked at. "I don't think we've met," Judith said. "Are you here for the 11 o'clock? I'm afraid that was this morning." "No, I was just looking in," Miss Marple said, pleasantly. "I'm staying with Dorothy Stanhope for a few weeks. The village churches in this part of the county are so lovely this time of year. I do like to see the autumn arrangements. I do them myself," Judith said, with a small warmth. "The flowers. It's something I've always loved." Miss Marple looked at the chrysanthemums on the altar carol's arrangement from earlier in the week, still standing. "Carol Bright does beautiful work," she said, "of those particular flowers." Judith said yes, she does, with perfect equilibrium. "I understand you and Edna Fallow were on the flower committee together. How dreadful for you, losing a friend so suddenly." "It has been very hard," Judith said. She said it with feeling. The feeling was the right shape and the right size, and it was delivered at the right moment, and Miss Marple found it for those reasons slightly too exact. Genuine grief tends to be uneven. It comes out at wrong times, in odd proportions. Grief that is perfectly proportioned and perfectly delivered is sometimes grief, but it is always also something else. "Did you see her recently?" Miss Marple asked. "Before it happened." "We'd had some distance between us," Judith said. "A misunderstanding. I'd been hoping to clear it up." A pause. "I wish now I had made more effort." Miss Marple looked at the flowers. Was it the kind of misunderstanding that could have been cleared up, do you think? Judith looked at her with a very slight change of expression. Not alarm, she was too controlled for alarm, but a recalibration. She was revising her sense of who Miss Marple was. "Most things can be," she said, carefully. "I've always found," Miss Marple said, still looking at the flowers, "that the most difficult misunderstandings are the ones where both people understand the situation perfectly, and the disagreement is not about what happened, but about what to do about it. That's much harder to resolve." She paused. "Because you can't really pretend not to know what you know." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Judith said, "That's a very philosophical observation." "I've had a long time to make observations," Miss Marple said mildly. She turned from the flowers. "I believe Constable Reeves will be wanting to speak to people who knew Edna. You'll find him very straightforward, I'm sure." She said goodbye and walked out of the church into the afternoon light, and she did not look back, which was itself deliberate. She did not need to see Judith's face at that moment. She had already seen what she needed to see, which was the small, controlled stillness of a person receiving information they had not expected, the information that someone in this village was no longer simply watching and wondering, but knew enough to say something, and was pointing toward the door of authority. She rang Constable Reeves from the telephone box on the High Street at 3:20. She told him, calmly and precisely, what she had learned from Ruth Fallow, what Dorothy had seen, what Vera Peel had heard, and what she believed needed to be done before the death certificate was issued and the formal process concluded itself in the wrong direction. She told him about the back gate and the footmarks. She told him about the timing of Judith's departure from the lane. She told him, finally, that she believed the police in the next town might wish to know that there was also an elderly woman named Mrs. Hartwell on Larkspur Lane whose finances might benefit from urgent examination. Constable Reeves listened to all of it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in a very measured way, "I'll need to make some calls, Miss Marple." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry to be the one adding to your Wednesday." He said he would look into it. She believed him. She walked back to Dorothy's in the late afternoon, and the village had the particular golden quality it gets in October, when the light is low and everything is very clear. She thought about Edna Fallow, who had sat with something heavy for months and had been trying, in her own quiet way, to find a path through it that didn't cost everything. She had been trying to balance the accounts her own way, not with the cold efficiency of Ruth's arithmetic, but with the more complicated currency of friendship and loyalty and the hope that people could be better than their worst decisions. She had not found the path in time. There are people, Miss Marple thought, who are too decent for the world they find themselves in. Not naive Edna had known what she was looking at, but decent enough to believe that decency, applied gently enough, might still work. Sometimes it did. And sometimes the thing you were being decent about had already decided there was nothing to be decent in return for. She had a long evening with Dorothy and soup, and the comfortable small talk of old friends, and the village was quiet outside, and the candle that Dorothy kept on her kitchen table burned down to half. Chapter 5, The House on the Lane. On Thursday morning, Constable Reeves arrived at Miss Marple's side of the lane, Dorothy's side, at 8 o'clock, with the particular expression of a man who had made calls the previous evening and was now in possession of information that had made his Wednesday considerably more complicated than he had intended. He accepted tea and sat at Dorothy's kitchen table with the careful posture of someone who was being official without wanting to seem threatening, and he told them, in measured terms, that the post-mortem examination had been requested. This was, on its own, not conclusive. A post-mortem could be requested for many reasons, but the fact that it had been requested suggested that the death certificate had not been straightforwardly issued, and the fact that Reeves was sitting at Dorothy's kitchen table rather than at his desk suggested that what he had heard the previous evening had introduced an uncertainty into what had looked like a settled matter. He said, with care, that the accounts of Mrs. Hartwell had been looked at by the nearest station's financial officer that morning, and that there was, he paused to find the right word, irregularity, which was a word that meant a great deal without committing to anything specific. He said that he had spoken to Mrs. Hartwell herself, who was a small, sharp, quite formidable 82-year-old, who had told him, in direct terms, that she had given Judith Crane access to her account to help with one specific matter 3 years ago, and had not been aware it was ongoing, and that when shown a printout of certain transactions she had gone very quiet, and then said, with the precision of a person who had just resolved something they had been confused about for a long time, "I knew something wasn't adding up." Miss Marple thought about the tracks on Mrs. Hartwell's path from the back lane. Judith Crane had known Mrs. Hartwell well, had been to the house often. The back lane access was quicker and less visible than coming through the front, and a person who visited an 82-year-old woman regularly for 3 years could find 100 unremarkable reasons to use it. And if, on a Monday evening in October, that person needed to come from Mrs. Hartwell's house to Edna Fallow's house by a route that did not involve Larkspur Lane in full view, the back lane was exactly the right route to take. "Has anyone spoken to Judith Crane?" Miss Marple asked. Reeves said an officer from the neighbouring station would be doing so today. He said it with the air of a man handing something off to a larger mechanism, which was correct. This was now bigger than a village constable and a quiet Wednesday, and he knew it. Miss Marple thanked him, and he thanked her, and he left. And Dorothy sat at the kitchen table in the aftermath of his visit and looked at her teacup for a long time. "Will they be able to prove it?" Dorothy asked at last. "That depends on several things," Miss Marple said. "The post-mortem may show something. The financial evidence is already compelling. What Vera and Dorothy, what you witnessed, adds to it. What Ruth can tell them about what Edna found will be important." She paused. The difficulty with cases like this is that the people with the most direct knowledge are also the people who have the most complicated feelings about what they know. They feel responsible. They feel guilty for not speaking earlier. They wonder whether speaking now, after the fact, makes them complicit in some way they can't quite articulate. Do you think we are? Dorothy asked. Complicit? I think, Miss Marple said, that every person in this village who heard something and said nothing made an individual choice that was entirely human and entirely understandable. And I think the accumulation of those choices produced a result that no single person intended. She paused. That is not the same as innocence. But it is not the same as guilt either. It is the particular moral territory of people who live in communities, which is to say, people who have learned, slowly and without noticing, that the peace of the whole is often maintained by the silence of the parts. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Edna used to say something. I've been thinking about it since Monday. She used to say, "You don't have to speak loudly to speak truly." She said it about the flowers, actually, about how a simple arrangement could say more than an elaborate one. She paused. She was trying to tell me something. I think she was trying to tell me something for weeks, and I wasn't listening in the right way. Miss Marple said, "Gently, you're listening now." She spent the morning at Mrs. Hartwell's house. She had not been inside it yet. And she wanted to. Not because she expected to find new evidence, but because she wanted to understand the setting, to see what Judith Crane had seen when she walked through that back gate and sat in that parlour and made herself indispensable to an old woman who had no close family and who trusted the people she knew. Mrs. Hartwell was, as Reeves had said, formidable. She received Miss Marple in a chair by the front window that gave a clear view of Larkspur Lane better than Vera Peel's and better than Dorothy's, and she poured tea with steady hands and looked at Miss Marple with eyes that were entirely clear. "I'm not senile," she said before Miss Marple had asked anything. "I know everyone assumes I am. People assume that anyone past 80 who lives alone must be drifting. I'm not drifting." She paused. "What I am is trusting. I trusted Judith. I liked her. She seemed to care about me." She stopped. I don't know whether she did care, actually, or whether that was also a performance. "People are rarely purely one thing," Miss Marple said. "It is possible to take advantage of someone and also care for them, at some level. It doesn't make the taking advantage acceptable. But it does make it more complicated." Mrs. Hartwell looked at her with something that was almost gratitude. That's a truthful thing to say. Most people would say she was just a bad person, and leave it at that. Bad and good are rarely the whole story, Miss Marple said. Usually the more useful question is what people want badly enough to do the wrong thing for. She paused. "Do you know what Judith needed the money for?" Mrs. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know she was paying for her mother's care. A home, outside the area. Very good, very expensive. Her mother has advanced dementia. Judith visits every week." She looked at her. "I know because she told me. In the early days she told me about it quite openly. She said it cost more than she could manage on her salary and that she didn't know what she was going to do." A very long pause. "I didn't know, at the time, what she had decided to do." The room was quiet. Outside, the lane went about itself. A car passed. Somewhere a door closed. Miss Marple sat with what Mrs. Hartwell had told her, and she felt the moral fracture of it, the crack that ran through the middle of this story, and made it impossible to hold simply. A woman who had been paying for her mother's care by stealing from an old woman who liked her. A woman who had responded to Edna's confrontation by reaching for the language of friendship to make Edna carry the weight of the knowledge. A woman who had, in the end, done something terrible to keep the arrangement from being exposed, and who had done it to the person who had been trying hardest to give her a chance. It was not a simple story. It never was. The afternoon brought a change in the weather and a change in the village. Not dramatic Ashwick Hollow was not a place of dramatic gestures, but perceptible. The sort of change that happens when a thing that has been held in suspension is released, and the air adjusts. 2 officers from the neighbouring station arrived at Judith Crane's house on Weston Street at 2:30. Miss Marple knew this because Dorothy's post office window faced the High Street, and the High Street had a clear view of Weston Street's junction. and Dorothy had been unable to resist watching, which Miss Marple could not fairly criticise, as she had been watching from the same window. They were inside for a long time, over an hour. When they came out, Judith Crane was not with them. They drove away, and the curtain of Mrs. Peel's house at the far corner twitched and went still. Miss Marple thought about what it meant that Judith had not been taken away. It meant they were gathering rather than concluding. The post-mortem had not yet produced its findings. The financial evidence was strong but circumstantial, without a mechanism, without knowing exactly how Edna had died and whether that death was natural or assisted. The testimonies of Dorothy and Vera and Ruth were important, but none of them had seen anything definitive. What had been seen was a woman on a lane late at night, coming from a direction that was consistent with having visited a house whose resident was found dead the next morning. What had been heard was voices, and a gate, and one person's account of what Edna had discovered. It was enough to justify an investigation. It was not, as yet, enough for more than that. Miss Marple did not find this frustrating. Patience was not something she had to practice, it was simply her natural state in these situations. She had learned long ago that the truth did not always arrive fully formed, and did not always arrive quickly, and that the most dangerous thing one could do was to mistake the shape of what was forming for the shape of what had been completed. She spent the late afternoon walking the village, and she had one of those evenings that settle over a difficult place like a cloth, over furniture covering things without removing them, making them temporarily invisible. The village had the quality of a held breath. She walked past the church and past the bakery and along the lane behind the church, and she stopped at Edna's back gate again and looked at it in the early darkness, and thought about Edna Fallow, sitting in her chair, curtains undrawn, tea in her hand, in the hour before someone came through that gate. Had she been waiting? Had she known Judith would come? It was possible. If Edna had sent word, a note, a telephone call asking Judith to come and speak with her again, asking for the chance to resolve things, then Judith would have known where Edna would be and when, and would have known that the curtains would not yet be drawn, because Edna never drew them before dark. And she would have known that the milk had not been collected, and perhaps she had counted on the impression of a woman who had simply had a quiet decline in the night, alone in her chair. These were speculative thoughts, and she held them loosely. The post-mortem would tell its own story. Carol Bright came to see her at Dorothy's that evening. She came of her own accord, which Miss Marple thought was significant. She had not sought Carol out, and had not asked Dorothy to approach her. Carol had decided herself, which meant she had been deciding since the previous day, and had arrived at a conclusion. She sat at Dorothy's table with her coat still on, which meant she was not intending to stay, but had needed to come, and she said, "Directly and without preamble I heard Judith on the lane. The night Edna died. I heard her walking. I know her footsteps. She wears heeled boots. They have a particular sound on this surface. She was walking back from the direction of the church lane." Quickly, she paused. "I know I should have said something before. I didn't, because she stopped." Miss Marple said, quietly, because saying something about Judith always becomes more complicated than saying something about anyone else. Carol looked at her with a slight shock of recognition. "Yes," she said. "Yes, exactly that. I've seen it happen to other people. Every time someone questioned something she'd done, somehow the conversation shifted, and by the end the person who'd questioned it was on the defensive. I've watched it for years." She paused. "I didn't want to go through that. I didn't want to be the one who had it in for Judith." She stopped again. "That's not a good enough reason, is it?" "It's a human reason," Miss Marple said. "That's different from good enough." Carol told her the same things, in her own form, that Vera had told her. The sound of heeled boots on the lane, the timing close to 11, possibly a little after. The direction from the back lane, not from Weston Street where Judith lived. She had not seen Judith on the lane before that, not earlier in the evening, which might mean Judith had arrived by the back route at both visits. Or that Carol had not been watching at 9:30. After Carol left, Miss Marple sat alone in Dorothy's front room for a while, with the lamp off and the lane outside the window, and the village being dark and quiet in the way that villagers at 9 o'clock in October are dark and quiet. She thought about kindness. She thought about how it is possible to build a life on the appearance of kindness in a way that is profoundly effective precisely because most people want very much to believe in the people who are kind to them. Judith had been kind to Mrs. Hartwell. Judith had been a good friend to Edna for 7 years. Judith had cared for her mother's needs with a constancy that was, in its own way, admirable. None of it excused what she had done, but it explained why the village had taken so long to say it out loud. Because when you have known someone as kind, you don't simply revise that knowledge when you encounter something that contradicts it. You try to reconcile. You look for the explanation that lets the kindness remain true, and by the time you have run out of explanations, a great deal of time has passed, and you find yourself standing at a garden gate at 7:30 in the morning, not speaking. She went to bed, and she slept, and the village slept too, and the lane was quiet, and somewhere at the end of it, in a house with cream-painted walls and a car in the drive, Judith Crane sat with whatever it was she was sitting with. Chapter 6, What the Tea Said the Post-Mortem Findings came on Friday morning, and they came quickly, which told Miss Marple that the examining doctor had found what he had been looking for. Constable Reeves appeared at Dorothy's door at 10 o'clock with the formal bearing of a man delivering information he had not wanted to need to deliver. Edna Fallow had not died of natural causes. The cause of death was cardiac failure, but it had been precipitated, the report, as Reeves conveyed it with careful professional distance by a substance found in the tea. Not a dramatic poison. Not something that would appear in a thriller novel. A medication, a specific cardiac medication, that, in excess, will produce exactly the kind of quiet, irreversible failure that looks. To a milkman standing in a doorway, like a woman who has died in her sleep, in her chair, in the way of women who live alone and have no one to notice. The medication was one that Edna did not take. She had no cardiac prescription. The substance should not have been in her body. It was, however, a medication that Dr. Neville's surgery had prescribed. Not to Edna. To another patient, though the report did not name the patient, and Reeves would not confirm it, Miss Marple was quite clear in her own mind about who that other patient was. Reeves said, with the controlled steadiness of a man who was professionally relieved to be operating with information rather than supposition, that the case had now been formally referred to the detective constabulary in the next town, and that officers would be in Ashwick Hollow today. He said that the statements that had been given by Dorothy, by Vera Peel, by Ruth Fallow, by Carol Bright were all now part of a formal record, and that he was grateful. He said this last part in a way that suggested he meant it personally as well as professionally. He looked at Miss Marple before he left and he said, "I'd like to ask how you managed to piece it together in 3 days, but I'm not sure I'd understand the answer." Miss Marple said, "You would, I think. It's mostly paying attention to the things people don't do." She paused. Dr. Neville didn't look at the women at the gate on Monday morning. He knew something was not right about that death. He may not have known the full picture, but he had a feeling, and he was trying to keep it at a distance. Reeves said he would be having a conversation with Dr. Neville as well. After he left, Dorothy stood in her front room with her hands clasped in front of her in the way of someone who has just had something confirmed that they had been half hoping would remain unconfirmed. "She put something in the tea," Dorothy said. Not a question. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "She came through the back gate. They had a conversation, that's what Vera heard. And then she put something in the tea and she left, and she went home." Dorothy paused. And Edna sat there, in her chair, with her curtains open because she'd been in the middle of a conversation and hadn't drawn them yet, and she drank the tea because it was her tea, in her cup, made in her kitchen. And Judith was someone she'd known for 7 years. Miss Marple said nothing. There was nothing to add. Dorothy said she must have been frightened. At the end, "Do you think she knew?" Miss Marple thought about this carefully. "I think she may not have," she said. "The mechanism is quiet. And she may not have known what to look for. She would have felt ill. She might have attributed it to distress, to the difficulty of the evening. She paused. There is a kindness in not knowing. I believe she was afraid, yes, afraid before Judith came, afraid of what she was going to have to do. But I don't think she was afraid in the last moment. I think she simply was. And then she wasn't. It was the most honest answer she had. Dorothy made more tea, which was her response to most things, and was no less valuable for that. The detective constabulary arrived in the afternoon, 2 officers, not in uniform, who spoke to Dorothy briefly and then went methodically down Larkspur Lane, house to house, clipboard in hand. Miss Marple watched from Dorothy's front room window as they went first to number 6, then past the cottage which was still sealed to the house beyond, and eventually to number 2 across the lane, where the flower box had been recently watered. She had not yet investigated number 2, and she found herself curious. She asked Dorothy who lived there. Dorothy said it was a Mr. Graves, who was widowed and retired and kept himself fairly private, didn't come to the village events much, but was pleasant enough when you encountered him. She said he had a clear view of Edna's front door from his sitting room. Miss Marple thought about that for a moment and then said she might just take a short walk. She did not go to number 2 directly. She went first along the lane in the direction of the church, walking slowly, and then she came back on the other side, which brought her past number 2's garden gate. She could see through the window the glow of a television and the back of a man's head. The sitting room was arranged as she had expected, with the main chair facing the television, which was on the wall to the left of the window. Which meant the window was to the right, which meant, from that chair, you could turn your head very slightly and see directly out of the window to the cottage opposite. Mr. Graves, it seemed, had a habit of keeping his window box watered. She did not knock on the door that evening. She had enough information for one day, and she had learned that pushing too far too fast produced diminishing returns. What she had was sufficient. What she needed now was for the proper mechanism to do its work. But she filed Mr. Graves away carefully in the part of her mind reserved for people who might yet have something useful to say. By Friday afternoon the village had changed in the way that villages change when the thing that was only whispered is now spoken aloud. Not noisily, not dramatically, but people who passed each other on the lane made eye contact in a slightly different way, the way you look at someone when you have shared a difficult thing without speaking of it and have finally spoken of it, and there is relief in that, and also a small private shame. Miss Marple observed this from Dorothy's bench, which she had come to think of as the most informative piece of outdoor furniture she had encountered in years. She watched the lane, and the lane watched itself, and the detective officers came and went. At 3:30, Judith Crane walked out of her house on Weston Street. Miss Marple could see Weston Street's junction from where she sat, and she walked in the direction of the High Street. She was dressed neatly, as she always was. She carried a bag. She walked at the pace of a woman on an errand. She did not look toward Larkspur Lane. One of the detective officers fell in beside her half a block along. The conversation was brief, less than a minute, and Judith stopped walking, and they stood on the pavement for a moment, and then Judith said something, and the officer said something, and then they walked together toward the officer's car, which was parked outside the chemist. She did not come back that evening. Miss Marple did not know what had been said. She did not know what evidence had accumulated to that point, or whether the conversation at the car had been an arrest or a request, or something in between. She would, she thought, find out in due course. What she knew was that Judith Crane had walked calmly out of her house on a Friday afternoon and had not walked back, and that the lane, and the village, and the light over the old church had continued exactly as they had before, because that is what villages do. Mr. Graves knocked on Dorothy's door at 5 o'clock. He was a man in his early 70s, medium height, with the look of someone who had once been athletic and was now merely careful about his body. He carried his hat in his hand, which was a gesture Miss Marple hadn't seen in some time. And he said he was sorry to intrude, and Dorothy said of course not, come in, and he sat at the kitchen table and looked at Miss Marple with something that was a mixture of recognition and relief. I saw her, he said. Monday night. I was in my chair, television off, just sitting. I sometimes sit in the dark when I can't sleep. I looked out and I saw a woman come along the lane from the direction of the church lane. Heeled boots. Dark coat. She went to Edna's front door. He stopped. She knocked, and the door opened and she went in. I don't know how long she was in there. I stopped watching. I went to bed. He paused. I've been watching this lane for 4 years. I know who belongs on it. I saw her come back out. Eventually, she was carrying a small bag when she came in. She wasn't carrying it when she came out. The room was very quiet. The small bag, Miss Marple said. Can you describe it? Canvas, I think. Dark, the sort of bag you'd put things in. He stopped. I didn't think I didn't understand what I was looking at until the next morning. And then by the time I understood, there were people at the gate, and I thought I didn't want to say it wrong. I didn't want to. He stopped again. You didn't want to accuse someone of something you couldn't be certain about, Miss Marple said. Yes, and now? Now? I'm certain. He looked at his hat in his hands. I've been sitting in that chair looking at that window for 2 days thinking about what it means to be certain and not speak. I think it means you've made a choice. I didn't want to have made that choice. He looked up. I rang the detective constabulary this morning. They're coming tomorrow to take a statement. Miss Marple said, good. She said it simply and without qualification, because it was simply good. He left shortly after, hat back on, walking back to number 2 with the slightly lighter gait of someone who has set something down. She watched him go from Dorothy's doorstep, and the lane was going orange with the evening, and the church bell struck 6, and somewhere up the lane a light came on in Vera Peel's front room. Dorothy came to stand beside her. I think this village is going to feel different after this, she said. Yes, Miss Marple said. I think it will. Different good or different bad? Miss Marple thought about it honestly. Different true, she said at last, which is neither comfortable nor miserable. It's just what is, once you've decided to look at it. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you came, she said. I am too, Miss Marple said. And she meant it, which was not always the case after she had been involved in something like this. Sometimes she came away from these things feeling the weight of what human beings were capable of doing to each other. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes she came away feeling something else. She felt it now, standing on Dorothy's doorstep with the evening coming in over the lane, watching a village readjust itself to a truth it had been avoiding. Not happiness exactly, but something warmer than resolution. The particular quiet that comes after a thing has been named at last. Chapter 7 The Lane. In November, Miss Marple stayed in Ashwick Hollow for 3 more weeks. She had not planned to. She had arrived for a 10-day visit and had found herself still there as October gave way to November, the light changing from gold to grey. The village adjusting around the absence of Judith Crane, the way a body adjusts around a removed splinter with discomfort at first, and then with a gradual surprised recognition that the inflammation, which had seemed so normal, had been the problem all along. Judith Crane was formally charged 6 days after her removal from the lane, charged with Edna Fallow's murder and with financial abuse. The charges were not contested in the manner Miss Marple had half expected. There was no great machinery of denial, no effort to reframe or redirect. Judith had. It later emerged through the slow delivery of information that followed the initial charge, been very quiet when she was taken in. She had asked for a solicitor, which was her right, and she had said very little beyond that. The performance of composure that had served her so well on the lane, in the church, in all the rooms of her village life, had apparently not outlasted the moment when the room was official. Miss Marple thought about this. She thought about how much energy it must take to be someone like Judith, for the number of years she had been being Judith, to manage every impression, to turn every challenge back, to ensure that your kindness was always visible and your intent was always obscured. It was exhausting work, probably the sort of work that eventually makes the silence of a charge room feel almost like rest. The financial examination of Mrs. Hartwell's accounts confirmed what Ruth had told her, and more. The amounts taken over 3 years were not enormous by some measures, but to Mrs. Hartwell, who lived on her pension and had managed her savings with the care of someone who had worked all her life to have them, they were significant. The flower fund discrepancy was small, comparatively, but it had been the crack in the wall that Edna had found, and it had led her where it had led her. Dr. Neville had not been charged with anything. He had been spoken to at length. He had admitted, with apparent honesty, that he had had a concern about the death from the beginning, not a certainty, but a professional discomfort, and that he had not acted on it as he should have. His formal caution was not Miss Marple's business to know the details of, but she was told, indirectly, that the situation had been addressed through the proper channels, which she hoped meant with some seriousness. A doctor's discomfort with the appearance of a death was not a small thing to leave in a drawer. He had prescribed the medication to Judith Crane's mother. That was confirmed. The care home had a record of it, and Judith had collected it on a home visit in September, 3 weeks before Edna died. A small thing, collected in person, unremarkable to everyone who had noted it at the time. These were often the mechanics of terrible things small, unremarkable, only visible in retrospect. Miss Marple walked the village in those 3 weeks, with the particular attentiveness of someone who has seen the interior of a place and is now seeing the exterior again and noticing the differences. She walked past St. Cuthbert's and observed that the flowers on the altar, now arranged by Carol Bright alone, had a simplicity and a gentleness to them that was different from the previous arrangements. Less technically polished, perhaps, more honest. She walked past Mrs. Hartwell's house and saw that Constable Reeves had arranged for a social services visitor to come twice a week, which was sensible, and that Mrs. Hartwell had placed a pot of orange chrysanthemums in her front window, which was cheerful. She walked past Edna's cottage, which was still quiet, waiting for Patricia to come from Bristol and decide what to do with it. She thought about Patricia, who had been rung on the night of the discovery and had come and gone in the space of 2 days for the identification and had not yet returned, and who would have to come back and sit with her mother's things and make decisions. She hoped Patricia would take her time. She hoped someone would tell her that her mother had been brave. Ruth came to the village once, in the 2nd week of November. She came quietly, by car, and she went to the cottage and stood outside it for a while, and then she went inside with the key that had been given to her by Reeves, and she was in there for about an hour. She came out carrying a small box, and she stopped on the lane, and she looked at the gate, and she looked at the church at the end of the lane, and she looked at nothing for a moment. Then she got in her car and drove back to Crane's Bottom. Miss Marple happened to be on the lane when Ruth came out. She said hello, and Ruth said hello, and then Ruth said, "She should have come to me sooner. I would have helped her sooner." She said it the way you say a fact that is also an ache. Miss Marple said, "She was trying to do it kindly." Ruth said, "I know." She looked at the box in her hands. That was her, always trying to do the hard thing in the kindest way. It takes longer that way, sometimes too long. She drove away, and Miss Marple stood on the lane, and the wind came along it from the direction of the church. And the leaves on the old horse chestnut were nearly gone now, just a few brown flags, and the village was very quiet in the way of villages in November that have finished with something and have not yet decided what comes next. She thought about Edna Fallow, who had not been a complicated woman in the way the world usually means, not clever or ambitious or driven by difficult motives. She had simply been good. She had been fundamentally, practically, quietly good, and she had spent the last months of her life trying to reconcile that goodness with a situation that required something sharper than goodness could provide. She had not found the reconciliation in time. That was the loss in this story. Not dramatic, not spectacular, just the quiet, irrevocable loss of a woman who had been trying. Miss Marple left Ashwick Hollow on a Thursday in mid-November, which was a day of thin rain and bare trees and the particular grey-white light of a November morning that she had always found beautiful in its own honest way. Dorothy drove her to the station, which was a 10-minute drive on the back road, and they talked about nothing in particular. which is the only thing worth talking about when you are saying goodbye to a friend after a difficult shared experience. At the station, Dorothy held her hand for a moment on the platform and said, "Do you think it will be all right?" The village. Miss Marple thought about this honestly. "I think it will be different," she said. And different is not always comfortable. There will be people who feel guilty about their silence, and people who feel that the silence was reasonable, and people who feel that the whole thing is a reflection of something wrong with the community itself. All of those feelings will be partly right and partly wrong, and it will take some time to sort through them. She paused. But the truth is out now. A truth that is out is much harder to arrange yourself around than one that is in. People are adaptable. They'll manage. Dorothy said, "That's what I needed to hear." "I hope it's true," Miss Marple said. On the train, she sat by the window and watched the countryside go by the fields and hedgerows, the occasional village, the November sky, doing what November skies do, which is to make everything beneath it look simultaneously stark and clarified. She thought about what she was taking away from Ashwick Hollow, which was what she always thought about on trains home from these places. She was taking away the image of those three women standing at the gate on a Monday morning, not speaking. She found she didn't judge them as harshly now as she might have 3 weeks ago. She understood them better. She understood that they had each individually been in the situation of knowing something and not knowing what the knowing cost them, and that they had each made a calculation. And the calculation had felt safe in the moment and had felt less safe the longer it went on. She understood that silence in a village is not always chosen. Sometimes it is the thing that fills the space when too many people are too afraid to be the one who breaks it. She understood Judith too, in a way she would not have said out loud because it was not the sort of understanding that was useful in conversation, not forgiveness that was not hers to give, and it was not what she meant. But comprehension. A comprehension of how a person might begin with a genuine need, a mother in a care home, a cost that exceeded a salary, a small act of borrowing that seemed temporary, and how that small act, unjustifiable from the beginning, might nevertheless be made bearable to the person, doing it by the careful construction of a narrative in which they were not quite the villain. The narrative that said Mrs. Hartwell didn't miss it. The narrative that said Edna would understand eventually. The narrative that said the friendship was real even while being leveraged. People who do wrong things have to live with themselves somehow, and they almost always find a way, which is one of the more troubling things about human beings, and one of the things Miss Marple had spent her life observing. She thought about Edna's question to Vicar Harper about the right thing when the right thing was unpleasant. She thought about how Edna had been trying to answer that question for herself by being kind about it, by giving Judith the chance, by believing in the possibility of the best version of how things might go. She thought about how Judith had answered that same question, in her own way, by reaching for the worst option available, and how the gap between those two answers was the entire moral distance of the story. She thought about the tea, cold in a dead woman's hand in the morning, such a small thing to carry such a large weight. Edna had made it herself, probably. She had been a woman of routine, and making tea at the end of an evening conversation was routine. She had not known what was in it. She had only known that Judith had agreed to talk, and that maybe things could still be resolved, and that this was what she had been hoping for, in some form, since August. She had not been wrong to hope. She had only been wrong about who she was hoping about. Outside the window, a village passed too quick to name, there and gone. A church spire and a cluster of rooftops, and a lane leading somewhere, and Miss Marple watched it pass with the particular feeling she always had at the end of these things, which was not quite sadness and not quite peace, but something that lived between them. A kind of informed sorrow. The sorrow of someone who has looked at a terrible thing clearly and has not looked away, and who understands that looking clearly is a form of respect for the people the terrible thing has touched. She would write to Patricia. She had decided this on the platform with Dorothy and had not said it out loud, because it was a private decision. She would write to Patricia in Bristol and tell her, in gentle terms, that her mother had been brave and had been trying to do the right thing, and had not been alone in the end, not entirely alone, because there had been people who had heard what happened and had eventually chosen to say it. She would not describe it as justice, because she was not sure it was. Entirely, she was not sure justice was ever entire. But she would say that it was truth, and that truth at least had been given to Edna Fallow's memory, which was the least that the memory of a good woman deserved. The train pulled into the next station and stopped, and started again, and Miss Marple settled back in her seat with her bag on her lap and the countryside outside, and she thought that Ashwick Hollow would find its way. Not quickly, not without difficulty. But the village would readjust as villages do, and the lane would continue to be the lane, and the horse chestnut on the corner would put out leaves again in the spring, and Tom Briggs would continue his milk round, and Mrs. Hartwell would keep her chrysanthemums in the window, and St. Cuthbert's would have its flowers on the altar on Sunday mornings. Arranged by Carol Bright with a simplicity she had perhaps found her way to only recently, and somewhere in the village people who had stood at a gate and not spoken would carry what they carried, and would live with it, and would perhaps, when the moment came again, as it always eventually did, the moment where something is known, and the question is whether to say it would remember what the cost of silence had been. Not for themselves. For Edna. Miss Marple looked out the window and thought about a woman in a chair, curtains open to the dark, with a cup of tea and a hope that the evening would resolve itself. And she thought, you were not wrong to try. You were not wrong at all. Some people fail us, and we still were not wrong to try. The train moved on, and the rain moved along the windows, and the November countryside did what it did, which was to be bare and clear and honest about what remained when everything unnecessary had been taken away. That, Miss Marple thought, was enough to know. They all heard it, but no one spoke end a candlelight village mystery.